All right. So recording. So we've been working in Python and Django and using classes in OOP, specifically in Python up until this point. But when we're doing React, React has the option to use object-oriented programming, but we haven't done object-oriented programming in JavaScript yet. So what I'm going to do is just do a quick review of, side-by-side comparison, what a class looks like or OOP looks like in Python, and then what the equivalent of that looks like in JavaScript. So what I'm going to do is cd desktop, cp challenges, November, directory, JavaScript classes, cd JS classes. I'm going to open this into a new VS Code window. And let's see. All right. And what I'm going to do is zoom in once. And I'm going to make two files. So I'm going to touch a person. That's kind of creepy. I'm going to touch the person.javascript file as well as a person.python file. So I've got a person JavaScript file and I've got a person Python file. I'm going to split the screen here. There we go. Okay. So if I wanted to create a person class in Python, I can do class person, and every object or class needs a def dunder init, takes in self, and let's just say the person class takes in a name as well as a hometown. And I need to create some instance variables in this person class. So I can say self.name equals name and self.hometown equals hometown. Next, I want to create a instance method called say def say hello, which takes in the self keyword and then just returns an F string that says, hi, I'm self.name and I'm from self.hometown. So I created a person class. I'm initializing it with a name and hometown. I'm assigning those arguments to instance variables, self.name, self.hometown. And I've got this instance method called say hello that just returns an F string that says, hi, I'm self.name and I'm from the self.hometown. Questions about creating a person class in Python? All pretty familiar? All right. So if I wanted to create a new instance of say like Tom, I'm going to say person, my name is Tom, and hometown, I'll just say, what is it, Lombard. So that's where I'm from. And if I want to print tom.name, I can get my name. If I wanted to print say hello, I can say hello. And if I were to come down here in the terminal and execute this person class, Python person.py, I see get Tom. So I can just say like P1 actually. So like P1 is person one. Right there. So if I can come up here, do the same thing. So person one, the instance of person is P1 and the P1's name is Tom. P1 instance, say hello. Hi, I'm Tom and I'm from Lombard. Questions about creating a class in Python? Should kind of be review. All right. Let's go ahead and create a class in JavaScript, completely identical to this, but using JavaScript. So in the past, it used to be like it was called like a, oh man, was it constructor method or no? I forgot what it was, but essentially you can pretty much create a new class in JavaScript very similar to that of Python. So I can say class person, again, uppercase person, open brackets. And then just like there's the initializer in Python, we have an initializer in JavaScript, except it's not called init, it's called a constructor. So constructor, which this doesn't take in like the self keyword or anything like that. This just straight takes in the arguments. So like name and hometown. So this is a constructor method. So think of it as just very similar to that of the init, but we don't have to do const or anything. We don't have to say like const constructor. We can just literally call the name of the method. And now instead of self, that refers to the instance. There's a similar keyword in JavaScript. It's just called this. Very similar to self. This refers to this, like myself. This name equals name. And this hometown equals hometown. Questions about the init versus the constructor? Nope. All right. So now we can emulate the say hello. We don't need to do like a const say hello or anything like that. We can just say hello, have that function. We don't need to take in a self or this or anything like that. And we can just return, a string interpolation. Hi, I'm this dot name, and I'm from this dot hometown. Now, in order to create a new instance of a person, I can do like person1 equals, instead of just calling person like we do in Python, we can say new person. So that we're creating a new instance. And just say Tom and Lombard. And down here, I can do console.log person1.name and person1.say hello and invoke it. So instead of running python.person.py like that, I can run node.person or node.person.js. And we get the same thing. So questions about a JavaScript class?
For that say hello method, can we use a Federo to create it, or does it have to be that?
You can. I think you can do. And I think that's the same thing.
Okay.
And you'll see that that's the preferred way to do it as we get into React. So, yeah.
How do you do inheritance with JavaScript class?
Good question. So let's just come down here. I'm going to delete. So in Python, let's do an employee class. So we have a person class, and let's create an employee class that inherits from the person class. So we can do class employee. And how do we inherit the person class? An employee. Parentheses person. Yep. And we can do def dunder init. Whoop. We can do self. That's not right. Name, hometown. And now what do we want to do? If we want to inherit, employee name, hometown, and let's do salary for the employee.
You need to do super init.
Super dot dunder init. And now we can pass in the name and the hometown. into the super init. And now we can do this dot salary equals, or not this. See,
Self.
thank you. See, I'm already used to JavaScript already. So there we go. And now I think that looks all right. Now we can either overwrite the say hello by declaring a new say hello, or we can just say like, actually, yeah, let's just overwrite it. Say hello, takes in the self. I'm just going to say everything's going to be exactly same, except, whoop, def say hello. I'm from this, and I make self.salary per year. Something like that. So let's go here. Employee 1 equals employee. Let's take it Tom, a hometown Lombard. Say salary is like 50,000. Is that 50? All right. And I can do like E1. I'll print E1 dot say hello. And let's see what that prints out. I'm just gonna come down here, clear the console, a new Python person. We get, hi, I'm Tom, I'm from Lombard, and I make 50,000 per year. So that's how we do it in Python. That's how we do inheritance in Python. Now the equivalent in JavaScript, let's come down here and delete that. I can do class employee extends the person class. So that's saying, hey, the employee is the employee is an extension of the person class. Again, in our constructor, we can need a construct. See, oh wow, I already did that for me. So I've got a snippet. So I do constructor that takes in, the name, hometown, salary. And just like there's a super over here, super under init, name, hometown. Here, all we have to do is write super and then the name and hometown. And then we can say this dot salary equals salary. Now, if I wanted to overwrite this hello function, say hello, my name is Tom. I'm from there. And I make this dot salary per year. So employee is an extension of the person class. We do the same constructor. We do super and just pass in the same arguments from the parent class. So name, hometown. We declare our instance variable, just like we do over here in the Python. And then we can just overwrite that as well. So I can do const employee 1 equals new employee, Tom, Lombard, and just say like 50,000. And now we can console log E1, employee 1, which is an instance of the employee, dot say hello. And if we run that, we can run node person.js. Questions on the equivalent of these? No? All right. If nobody has any questions, let me write something. What time is it? Okay. Let's go ahead and start with React. So I'm going to stop. Well, close this out. And I'm going to let's talk about React. Oop. Do some print. All right. Can anybody tell me what React is?
It's a framework that Facebook developed for making Facebook.
Yep. So React is a front-end framework for it's like a library, but a lot of people call it a framework. But yeah, it is a front-end framework to develop. It was developed by Facebook. So part of the reason why it's so popular is because of that fact, because React was developed by Facebook. It's got continuous support by Facebook, and it's just growing in popularity. There are other frameworks out there as well. So React, there's Vue.js, there's Angular, there's Svelte, there's React Native, which is also like React Native is specifically for developing mobile apps, but using essentially kind of like React. There's a lot of them. Like back in the early 2010s, Angular was really big. And then there's Angular 2, I think Angular 3. Yeah. Anyway. And then React came along, and React just kind of is growing and growing in popularity. So if you look at, what is it? Chicago. Built in Chicago. I'm just going to look at jobs. I haven't done this to see like dev engineer. If you know, is there React in here? Essentially, there's like a gazillion React developer positions opened up. They're like the most in demand for front end development is React. All right. So let's talk about React. So where does React fit in this whole picture? So you should be relatively familiar with the model view controller or the MTV in Django, model template views. Now we've been working in templates, HTML templates. Now we're going to split off those HTML templates and replace it with React. So that's where React fits in the MVC architecture. So it's Django and React models, views, and then we're bringing in React for the front end. Let's go in here. So let's just go ahead and build a React app from scratch without using the create React app thing. So I'm going to actually come over here. Did I close out that JavaScript classes? Oh. So I kind of just want to show you. But actually, before we do that, so the libraries needed to get the bare minimum off is React. So you need to install React DOM, which is a package that provides DOM specific methods. So you can inject React elements into the document object model. So most of your components should not need this to use this module. But you'll see this render method occasionally. Also, there's this React scripts library. It's optional, but highly recommended. It's a package that provides default scripts to run your React. It also includes Webpack and Babel. Don't worry about if you don't know what that is or have never heard those terms before. You don't need to know what they are right now, but just know that they exist. Here's a little more context as to what Babel is. So you won't necessarily work with Babel here, but just in case you do go out in your first role and you're working in React, you might see something called Babel or Webpack. So Babel is literally just a compiler that compiles the different versions of JavaScript and essentially makes everything backwards compatible. So it just takes all your new JavaScripts and compiles them so everything can run. So it doesn't matter what version of JavaScript you're running. And this is kind of what that file looks like. It's a Babel RC file. So just heads up, you might see this in the future at some point. There's also Webpack, which is a really big popular thing when using in React. It's a bundler that bundles all of your assets in your entire application. So JavaScript files, image files, videos, CSS. It bundles that all up into like a single file and that executes your code. And that's what's actually executing your application. And this is just an example of what a Webpack file looks like, or Webpack config file looks like. Don't worry about knowing what this does. I don't even know like what this does half the time. So don't worry about that right now. But installing that React scripts library manages all that for you. So that React scripts library. So what is the benefit of using React? So I'm just going to go to like Airbnb. So Airbnb uses React in the front end. And you can kind of tell I've got this plugin right here. It says this page is using production build of React. So if I say I want to go to, not the Cal, say like Seattle. Whatever, I'm flexible. So all this stuff is React right here. Actually, let's actually go back. Saugatuck, New Buffalo. All right. So right here, what's the benefit of using React? So if you think of this thing, if you were just writing web pages in like raw HTML, if this one page was a big HTML page, you'd have to have in your like HTML, you'd have to have like a div with like an image that says like New Buffalo 1 hour drive, and like another div that says like has another image. But all these are pretty much the same. So all these elements are essentially identical. The only thing that differs is maybe this little image, the location, and how far of a drive it is from, I guess, where I'm currently at in like Chicago. What's nice about React is I only have to write one of these in code once, and based off of my application, I can render this one piece of code, what is this, 8 different times by passing different parameters into what it's called a component, into this piece of code. And based off of like the arguments I pass in, it'll display New Buffalo, Saugatuck, Wisconsin Dells, and it also might display the different times. So if you think of each one of these pieces as a block of code, almost like a function, and depending on what you pass into that function determines what is actually being displayed right here. So if I pass in a different image, it'll display this image versus like this image. If I pass in a different location as like a parameter, or as an argument, it'll say New Buffalo versus Milwaukee, etc. So you can think of all these as one, they're called components. And a component is literally just a function or a class. So a component is literally just a function or a class. So all these are right here. This is a function, a function, a function, or a class, depending on how they decided to architect it. Likewise with down here, these are all very identical pieces of code or pieces of the DOM. These are all these are all the same pieces of code, just different parameters are passed in that renders a different image, this title here, etc. What questions do you have about React and like what are the benefits are?
Would it be correct in saying that it's like you're doing a for loop, like for each of these cities,
Yep.
put a picture with the name and the drive?
Yep, exactly. And you're going to see that in our code. We're going to be writing for loops that are pushing things into arrays, and we're going to be rendering those arrays into something that looks like this. And we'll have you download something called React Dev Tools. So right here, components, where you can actually see the actual layout of like a component. So I can see specifically what's passed in here. So here are some properties that are passed in here. I can kind of, this is really a complex, just trying to see if I can actually find the actual data that's passed in. So like right here, look at, here's a title that's being passed in as a property or like almost like an argument. I got an on-press, I've got some other information that's also passed in. I have a picture. So look at, I have a picture right here. So this is the URL, I think probably to that photo. So if I copy that, I don't know if this is going to work. I might not have access. If I click on that, look at, I get that image. And that's literally just being rendered right here. So this is all that stuff that's being passed into this component right here, into this component right there. So let's continue. Or does anybody have any questions on that?
Is that the only benefits?
No, I mean, there's certainly other benefits with regards to like managing state and properties and when to re-render stuff. And it's just kind of how you organize your code, but that's a really big benefit of it.
I thought that's kind of where it got its name, is very reactive to new things, new states.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. I didn't know that that's where they got that name, but yeah, I mean, that definitely makes sense. So depending on certain conditions that change in here, so maybe this piece of code changed, and instead of re-rendering or updating this entire web page, only this piece of block code, like only this piece of code actually changes. So instead of re-rendering the entire document object model, only a small piece of code changes or a small component changes on the screen.
So you said you'll usually either see Babel or Webpack, was it? How do you know, or how does the person using them know when to use which? Does it not make a big difference, or?
Oh, so these are used simultaneously. They're used in conjunction with one another. So usually there'll always be a Babel file or a Webpack file, but you won't see them in our code because React scripts, this library is going to manage all that for us. So we don't even have to worry about it.
Cool, thank you.
Yep. So let's go ahead. And before I get into this, let's again, this is kind of like a quick review of kind of what I just talked about. So I'm going to go through all this stuff, and don't worry about if you don't digest it all right now. Over the course of the next week, 2 weeks, we're going to touch on all these different components, or I don't want to say component, all these different aspects of React. So you're going to hear these term components. So a component is just lets you split the UI into independent reusable pieces of code. You're going to hear these things called class-based components, which I kind of just talked about. Class bases, like class-based components, as well as functional-based components. So I kind of just reviewed what a class is in JavaScript, and it's essentially going to look exactly like that when you're writing these components. You're going to also have, each component is going to have something like certain data, and you're going to hear these terms state and props. These are reserved keywords for React. So when you hear the word props, let's say it's a reserved keyword. So like the props keyword. So what are props? So props are just data that is passed into a class-based component or a functional-based component. It's literally just like an argument that you're passing in, but it's called props. State, on the other hand, is data that is local to that component. So props is data that we're passing into the component, where state is data that is declared and stored within that component locally. So state is an object that stores data that is local to that component, similar to props, but is only local to that specific component. Cool. And then there's JSX, similar to Jinja 2 and Python, how we were writing Python code in line with HTML. JSX is very similar. It looks exactly like HTML, but it allows us to write JavaScript in line with our HTML. It's just an it's just a syntax extension from JavaScript. Questions about any of this? Don't worry if you don't understand it all right now. We're going to go over it all. But what questions do you have about this? All right. So if you take a look at this page right here, this is like a screenshot of an old Airbnb. There's multiple elements on this page that can be considered very similar to one another, such as these little filter buttons, or I don't know if they're buttons or filters. We have these outdoor activities, so hiking, agriculture, camping. So these three elements are very similar to one another. Also, these elements down here are all very similar to one another. So we can safely assume that these are all individual components. And I'm just calling one of them component 1, component 2, and component 3. So component 1 is literally just this button right here. And you'll kind of see like the syntax, how it's like angle brackets, followed by the name, followed by a space, closing angle bracket. So that's kind of how you declare a component, or declare or execute or render a component. So we have 3 different components right here. But again, this component where it says dates, it's also, there's one that says guest, price, time of day, language offered. So this component 1 can probably be rendered 5 different times with different properties passed into it that determine whether or not it should say dates, guest, price, time of day, language offered. Same with component 2. Here's like a component 2, and that's probably being rendered 3 times. Likewise with component 3 down here. So all those are all the same components. So just rendered a different number of times. Questions about components and how they're rendered? Cool. All right. So let's take a look at component 3. Notice how component 3 has like an image, some like a little description, maybe like the activity. It also has, like the cost per person and how long, like, I don't know how long that activity lasts for. It also has like a star rating. Well, components can also render child components. So component 3, which is this big outlined one, may consist of other components within it. So there might be like a favorite icon component. That's this little heart is all it's responsible for is determining whether or not you favored that or not. So there might be a property passed in that says, hey, that has this user favorited this experience, true or false. And depending on whether it's true or false, it might be a grayed out heart, or if you've liked it, it might be, a red heart. And the only thing that's being passed in is a Boolean value, whether that user has liked it or not. You can also have like an image card component that displays this image. Down here, you can have like a card main component. I'm just naming these card main that has this component in it as well, that has, what type of experiences, a little description of it, the dollar amount passed into it, like per person. And then maybe the card main renders the star rating component or something like that. And the star rating is only responsible for displaying just these star ratings. Questions about a component that can also render like other components. So you can have components within components within components within components, and you're going to be seeing that. So here's an example of properties. So if you come up here, props, you're passing arguments down to a function. If you think of it like that, that might be beneficial. So components can accept data as props. So if you look at component 3, maybe component 3 has some data that we want to pass down to the image card. And maybe the image card has some data that we want to pass down to the favorite icon component. And it's being passed down as props. So you're going to hear that term a lot. So the component 3 is the parent component of the image and card main components. So props is passed down from the parent component down to the child component. So you're going to hear that. Hey, what props is props being passed down? What props does that component have? You're going to hear that term. And don't worry if you don't understand. Again, don't worry if you don't understand all that right now. We're going to go through it all. And here's just some code snippet of what that might look like. So in component 3, whether it's a functional based component or a class based component, remember all functions have a return statement. So let's just assume that these are all functional based components. So this component 3 functional based component returns a div, and it's returning the card image component and the card main component. And inside the card image functional based component, that might render the favorite icon component and like maybe some other elements as well. But so you can also, it's not just going to render components. It could render pretty much anything you want. It can render an H1 tag. It can essentially render any HTML element. But I just want to let you all know that it can also render other components. So example, like the card main component over here might render the star rating component. So here's the card main functional based component. In the return statement, it'll return a div. It'll return some other elements like the title, description, price, hours, kind of like what it's displaying here. And then it'll also return the star rating component. So these are just like some code snippets, and we're going to go through this later. Questions on that?
And if we wanted to pass something from the child to the parent, we can't do that, correct?
Yes, you can. And we'll cover that definitely. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So again, I'm just going to throw out pretty much everything, a lot of the stuff you're going to be seeing in React, but we're not going to cover it all today. We're going to be slowly introducing it as the weeks go on. So as I mentioned, there are 2 types of ways that you can create a component, such as like component 3, and all these are little pieces of reusable code. There's a class-based components and functional-based components. In the old React, the only way you can declare state, or if you wanted to have a component to have state, it had to be a class-based component. But going forward, you can do it in functional-based components now. And React is leaning more towards functional-based components. They want you to use functional-based components going forward. But we're going to introduce class-based components because whatever existing code base you work on is probably still going to use class-based components at some point because they haven't updated the code base and it's just old code. And if it's not broke, don't fix it. And they're not deprecating class-based components. Just know that going forward, they want to have everyone kind of use functional-based components. So over here on the left, this is an example of a class-based component. So we have a class. I'm going to call it a button component. For example, like one of these buttons. Let's just call that a button. And it extends the component class that's inherited from straight up React. So we're importing React and this component class. So this button component is inheriting from the component class. We can declare state at the very top. Again, state is a reserved keyword, which is for React. And then a class-based component always will have this render method at the very end, and that render method will always return whatever you want to display on the screen. Now, the very same version of that in a class or in a function-based component is just again, this looks like a normal function. Const button component equals open brackets or open parentheses followed by an arrow function. over here in the class-based component, when we're declaring state, or we're declaring the variables that we want to use throughout the component, we say state equals, which is an object, say count, initial value is 0. Whereas in class-based components, we use this function called useState, and that useState function takes in the initial value and it returns 2 values. This is called a useState hook. And don't worry, I'm not going to get into much of it right now because we're going to get into it later on today. It returns 2 values, a count, which is a variable, and another method that updates the count. Don't worry about that right now. And then here we just have 2 methods, or 2 functions that update the count method. Just, that's kind of what it looks like. And I'll slack this out. Something also about components. Components have life cycles. So there's 3 different states: mounting, updating, and unmounting. So mounting is when a component initially renders to the screen or to the document object model. So right when you load the page, all those components pass or display, that's when all the components mounted. And there's updating. So when a component changes state or props, so anytime that data within that component changes, so maybe I update the count of this button component. So once I update some data, I may want to trigger a re-render. So I can trigger, hey, update this component on the screen. And then there's unmounting, when a component is removed from the DOM, or the screen, essentially. So when it leaves from the screen, it's unmounting. And this is unique to class-based components. So again, back in the day, when they strictly use class-based components, there's these things called lifecycle methods that you can trigger certain pieces of code at certain points within the component's lifecycle. So these are lifecycle methods. These are reserved components or reserved methods that are already come with React. Component did mount, should component update, component did update, and component will unmount. Now there's other lifecycle methods that might be older, that might be deprecated, but these are the main ones right now. So these are strictly for class-based components. But since React is moving more towards a functional-based component architecture, they needed a way to replace these methods, but with functional-based components. And they did that. Oh, I'll show you now. So here's like a quick this is when the lifecycle components execute at different points in the component's lifecycle. So when a component is mounting in a class-based component, the constructor method is ran, the render method is ran then, and then the component did mount method is ran. When a component is updating, should component update render is executed, then the render method, then the component did update method. And when unmounting, the component will unmount method runs. Again, we're going to cover all this later on, but I just want to throw it all out there now, just so you can experiment or have some knowledge of it before we run into it. So again, as I said, as React is moving more towards a class-based, or I'm sorry, a functional-based component, they needed to replace all these lifecycle methods that are strictly for class-based components, and they needed to find a method to convert these essentially over to a functional-based component, and that method is useEffect. So there's a useEffect hook method that essentially does all of this, but in a single method for a functional-based component. All right. So I threw a lot of information at you just now. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. Be back at 10:34, and we'll actually jump into creating a React app. Okay, we just went through kind of like the high level overview of what React is, how it's kind of broken down up, and certain main attributes to React with regards to components, props, state, JSX. You're going to hear these terms a lot. Let's go ahead and create a React app from scratch. So we're going to do it just by installing everything manually. And then we're going to show you a quicker way to do it after that. So the first thing I'm going to do is if I want to create a package.json file, how do I go about doing that other than manually creating a package.json file? We did this way back in I think week 1 with def grandma almost.
npm init.
npm init. Thank you. So if I do npm init, it's going to say this utility will walk you through. I'm just going to click yes, yes, description, entry point. Yep. Okay. Yep. I'm just going to do everything as the default. Is this okay? Yes. So there we have a package.json file right here. Next, what do we need to do? What are the 3 libraries that I said we initially kind of should install? They're right here. So we need to install React, React DOM, and React scripts. So how do I install libraries in JavaScript?
npm I or npm install.
So npm install, you can do npm install or literally just npm I if you wanted to, but npm install. I'm going to do React. And if I want to install multiple libraries in one line, I could do npm install React, React DOM, and then what is it? React scripts. I think that's what it was. Just want to make sure. Yeah. So I'm installing React, React DOM, and React scripts. And you can come over here and see my package.json file. Let's see what that. So it's installing everything. And so we don't have to create a virtual environment like we did in Django. That's kind of what the package.json file is for. It manages the versions of all the libraries and everything that we want to install for our application. Also, the package.json file is similar to the requirements.txt file in that we can run this package.json file or just by running npm install, and it'll install all the libraries that we want to for our application. So it might take a little while. Don't worry about this worn, deprecated stuff. It's okay. It's going to take a little while. Does anybody have any questions about any of that?
Julie had asked in the chat
Oh.
if we should be encouraged to still use virtual environments with this.
No. Yeah. So you don't need to use virtual environments with JavaScript or React or anything like that. So you don't need to create a VNV, VENV or anything like that. All right. So notice how when I npm install everything, I got these dependencies. So these are the libraries that are required for this application to run. So there's dependencies here. You might see another one it's called dev dependencies. But yeah. So if we look at React scripts, provides default scripts for React, but it also includes Webpack. So here are our scripts right here, but we might need to install or add additional scripts to that to actually make our application run. So I'm just going to call Google React scripts, keywords none's getting started. All right. I'm just looking at certain things in here. Available scripts. So npm start is one of them. Folder structure. I'm just kind of looking at this. So this is kind of interesting. I might want to look at that. Let's see. Just want to see if they have an example of the script we actually need to put in there. Anyway, so instead of, so npm start, I'm just going to do start. And when I run this, I want it to run React scripts start. So when I end up running npm start, it's going to run this React script starts. Also notice how when I installed this stuff, it created that node modules directory and this package lock JSON file. All right. So don't worry about the package lock file and don't worry about node modules. You don't want to be messing with that right now. All right. So if I list everything out, I'm going to clear the screen down here. Let's actually zoom in a little bit. So next, what I'm going to do, so I've got this node modules, package lock JSON, and this package.json file. The next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to create two directories. So make directory, I'm going to create a public directory as well as a source directory, src. So did I click enter? All right, so I got a public directory and a source directory. Inside this public directory is where all my public facing assets are going to go. So inside this public directory, I'm going to create an index.html file. And in my HTML, I'm just going to create some boilerplate. And you might have heard of, I'll just say like React. I don't really need to do anything in here. I'm just going to get rid of that. And with React, you may have heard the term single page application or SPA. That's what React is kind of referring to as a single page application. Because we only have one index.html file, but this one index.html file is responsible for rendering our entire application. And so in our index.html file, inside the body tag, I'm just going to create a div, an empty div with an ID of, I don't know, what do you want to call it, app. So this has literally one, I'm just going to get rid of that script. Actually, I'm just going to move that up into the head. So inside the body, I literally have a single empty div with an ID of app. And I can call this whatever I want if I wanted to. I can call it whatever I want, but I'm just going to call it app because this is the entry point into our application. And now inside of the the source directory, right in here, I'm going to create another file called index.js. So I'm going to split the screens here. Get rid of the package.json. All right. And now this JavaScript, so let's look at this package JSON file. Notice how like the main entry point into our application is this index.js file. That's what's kind of being referenced right here. So the first thing I'm going to do is import React from React. The next thing I'm going to import is React DOM. So import React DOM from the React DOM library. And so I'm going to Google the React DOM library. So right here, React.js. So it looks like here. So the React DOM package provides DOM specific methods that can be used at the top level of your application. So this is the top level of our application. And as an escape hash to get outside of React model, blah, blah, blah. The most important components should not be used in this module, render, etc. But let's look at this render method right here. So React DOM, I'm going to say React DOM dot render, and this render method takes in an HTML element, or I'm sorry, what element I actually want to render to the screen, and then where do I actually want to render it inside of my HTML file. So maybe what I want to render is an H1 tag that says hello world. And where do I actually want to render it? I want to render it right here inside of this HTML, like right here in the side of this div. I want to insert it right there. So I know we haven't been working in JavaScript for a while. How can I access this element in JavaScript?
Document get element by ID.
I'm sorry, was that Brian?
Yeah, document dot get element by ID. App.
Document dot get element by ID app. So again, I got a public directory and a source directory. The public directory only contains HTML with one div inside of the body. And then inside of my index, or inside of my source directory, inside of my index.js file, this is the entry point into our application saying, hey, render this H1 tag right here inside of the index.html file. So let's go ahead and start this. So what's the command to start this application?
npm run start.
So I can run npm run start, or I can also just type start, npm start, but npm run start. Let's see what happens and watch what happens. So React scripts start. Unable to detect target browser. So it's saying, hey, inside of your package.json, we don't know what the default browser is or the target. So would you like to add the defaults to your package.json file? Yeah, why not? So it looked like browser list. It just added a bunch of stuff. And now it's just opening up right now. Let's see. Oh, there we go. So when I did that, it automatically opened up everything for me. It says you can now view React from scratch in the browser. So that's the name of this application. On my local host, it's right there. So now I look right here. There's my hello world. What questions do you have about?
For the way you're doing it right now, are you just trying to show us kind of how it works before, or is there a reason we would do this without using the npx create React app?
Yeah, I'm just showing you how it works if you build it straight from scratch.
Is there ever a reason we would build a React from scratch? Like, is there a plus side to doing that?
I can't think of one unless, yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
Unless, yeah, I don't know. I've never, like, from a production standpoint, I haven't seen one that's probably never used it from scratch. But I just kind of want to show you the React DOM, renders, whatever you want right here. And you insert it in the HTML by document.getElement by ID, and then the name of where you want to insert it at. So now we can actually start building stuff. So we can start inserting anything here, but it's not like we want our app to be a little more intuitive than just displaying this H1 tag, say hello world. So inside of my index or my source directory, I'm going to create an app.js file. And this app.js file is going to be a component. So I'm going to move this over here, get rid of that, get rid of this package.json file. And I highly encourage you to, I think you may already have it, but there's a Chrome extension. I think it's React Snippets, where you can automatically create a, like, so if I do RCS, it automatically creates a React component. But let's just go ahead and do it from scratch. So I'm going to first create a functional based component. So I'm going to import React from React. And then for a functional based component, it's just like writing a function. I'm going to call it const app. Like so. So I just created an app function, and this app function returns. So every function returns something, right? Whether it's Python, JavaScript, every function or method is going to return something or should return something. And what is returned in here is JSX. It looks exactly like Python, but it's JSX. So I'm going to say div. So it looks exactly like HTML. Or did I say Python? It looks exactly like HTML. And maybe here I want to say, welcome to React. And at the very bottom, I want to export this function so I can use it in other elements or other locations of my application. So I'm going to say export default app. And so now, instead of displaying this hello world, I want to just render this component right here. So I'm going to say import app from, is it just app.js? I think that's how I do it. So in place of this h1 hello world, I want to render this app component. Does anybody remember how to execute this app component? So if I want to execute this app, I just do app space / like that. So I'm calling this app component right here. It's going to come on into here and execute this, return this element, welcome to React. And if I refresh it, it says welcome to React. Just a quick reminder, inside of the return statement, it has to be encapsulated in only one div. So I can't have like 2 divs like that. So that's throwing a big error. But I can say like, hey, button, do something here. And if I see, and look at how it automatically re-rendered. What questions do you have about the React DOM render, how this is rendering?
Is it going to get mad at you if you put a div in that div?
No, so you can just keep doing stuff down here. So yeah, you can keep doing that. Here's another div, etc.
Is it good practice to write all your exports at the bottom, or can you write it in line with your function?
I've seen it done both, like so. So you can do it both, but I generally like exporting things up, everything at the very bottom. Cool. So this is a functional based component. So functional based component. I just want to convert this into a class based component. So there's a couple of things we need to do to make it a class based component. The first thing we need to do is import the component class from React. Base component. So here we can do class app extends. We want to inherit from the component class. And you don't always have to import it like this. You can also just do React dot component. And that's the same thing, but I like importing that. And then here we can call a constructor if we wanted to, call props, super props, but we don't necessarily have to. And then instead of returning something, the class-based component returns, I would say it always executes a render method at the very end. And the render method is what returns JSX. So I can literally, bring that up here. Format document. There we go. And now if I refresh it, nothing changes because it's the same. If I got rid of, see how it like automatically updates. And if you come over here, you can see the different components. So you can see like that's the app component. It doesn't have any props, doesn't have any state. But yeah. Questions about that?
Why is a component in brackets in the import statement?
Because it's not exported by default in the React. So if it was exported by default from the React library. So for example, here I'm exporting this for app. I'm exporting it as default. But if I come over here, yeah. if I just do, well, I'm gonna go back to functional base component. Essentially, if you export, if I got rid of that, it would still throw an error. So as, so if I just exported this app like so, I didn't export it as default. Over here, I'd have to put it in brackets, just like I'm doing it with the component library. And it's now it works. So essentially, it's because it's not being exported as default. So if you don't want to use the brackets, just export all your components as default.
And can you say again the difference between or why they're moving towards away from functional based? I think you already said it, but
so they're actually moving away from class based components.
Okay.
So they're moving towards functional based components because I don't know like the specific reason. I just can imagine that it just leaves for less. Essentially, functional based components, you weren't able to use props. Or I'm sorry, you weren't able to use state or anything like that in the old React days. You could only use state in class based components, and they wanted to be able to the flexibility to use state in functional based components as well. So once you're able to use state in functional based components, there's not really a purpose to have class based components. And essentially, like I would say, like JavaScript wasn't built to be an OOP language. And it's just easier for everything to be done functional instead of having to switch back and forth between functional based and class based components. So now you can just use functional based components. All right. Yeah, good question. What other questions do you have? All right. So we created this from scratch, but that's not necessarily how you're going to be doing it. I just kind of wanted to show you what it looks like. So I'm going to make a new directory called intro to React, cd intro to React. I'm going to open that up. And now we're going to just create a React app using the script create React app. So if I say like how to create React app, I'm going to get here, create a new React app at reactjs.org. We have this command, npx create React app, and then the name of your app. So just like Django has, Django-admin, start project, the name of the Django project, React has this npx, which is like npm, but it has additional capabilities. npx create React app. I'm going to say, I'm just going to call it, my app. And now this is probably going to take a little while. It can take, let's just see how long this takes. But see how it's installing React, React DOM, and React scripts. I don't know what the CRA template is, but we'll just take a look at it. And it's going to install a lot of files, and the architecture is going to be a little more involved, or a little more complex than what I just kind of created. What questions do you have about React so far?
Do you have to create a project like in Django for your apps, or is it only just?
It's just apps. So yeah, it's not like create a React project and then create multiple React apps within that React project. No, it's not. It's not done like that. It's just a single React app, and that's it. Oh, wow, that actually went pretty fast. So notice it says success, created my app at this location. Inside the directory, you can run several commands: yarn start, yarn build, yarn test. Yarn is very similar to React, or I'm sorry, npm, but yeah. So I can list everything out, and you can see my app right here. So I'm going to cd into my app. I'm going to clear the screen. I'm going to list everything out, just like how we kind of had in the previous one. We had our node modules, our package.json. We had a publics directory, a source directory, and instead of a package.json lock, they have a yarn lock, which is very similar. So I'm going to code-r. I'm going to open this into a brand new screen. There's my app. All right. And in order to start this, I'm just going to say npm start, and then we'll actually take a look at what it's doing. Starting the development server. Come over here. There it is. So here's the basic React app landing page. So it says edit source.app.js and save to reload. So let's just take a look at here. So in our publics directory, we have this manifest.json. This is literally just where it's storing images for this one. Don't need to really know about that. Here's some like the logos. Here's that index.html file. And if you look down here, instead of the app, they just have a root as their ID. I don't know what this robots.txt is. Don't know what that is. Here's the favicon. Anyway, so the publics directory essentially just has your images and the HTML. And then let's open up our source. So our source has
robots.txt is to tell search engines not to look into specific directories.
Awesome. Cool.
So you can specify what portions of your application are crawlable and not, but it's only a suggestion.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, good to know. Thanks. And then so now in our source directory, notice how we have a lot more stuff than just the index.js. So here's our index.js directory or file. It has React, React DOM, app. Don't worry about this report web vitals. Don't worry about this React strict mode. You can even delete that, but it's essentially just allows it to, or I believe it like monitors your app for like errors and stuff like that. but it could be a little confusing because it'll display things multiple times in your console. So this is just here for React. It's not required. This Web Vitals, I think this actually just like reports what it says. It reports performance, like information about your application. Don't really need to worry about that. You have your CSS. Here's your app.js. Here's your spec file for testing. Here's your index that we just went over. So notice how React Render renders this and then inserts it into the root. Here's that logo with this, which is a CVG file. Here's other information. Don't need to worry about any of this right now. So main thing, index.js and app.js. So here's my app.js file. Notice how it's a functional based component, but it's done using like a regular function, not like a arrow function, which is fine, but cool. So that's that. So let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back and we'll jump into some more React and using components and parents and stuff like that. All right, we just created a React app from using the npx create React app script, and it created all this public directory, source directory, and we have our app function here, this app component that is being rendered right here. So let's actually create let's just delete all that. And I want to create a little app called Clicker Counter. And if you've ever heard, has anybody heard of the cookie clicker application? Cookie clicker. So this is an application that literally just stores, this is the game. And you come over here and it's like literally, it's just called Cookie Clicker. And this app probably makes like hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars a year just from advertising and people coming here and clicking. So we're going to create a Cookie Clicker clone, not as interesting as this one, but I'm getting carried away. I'm getting distracted. But I just want to create a clicker where I'm clicking a button and it counts how many times I click it. So here's my app. I'm going to say create a app that says, let's say H1, I have been clicked X times. And I'm going to create a button down here that says click me. So it looks like we don't need this logo anymore. Cool. So if I come over here and right here, we got our little, I have been clicked X times. And when I click this, I want this to increment by 1 every time I click it. So there's a couple of things that I want to do for my personal preference. I don't want this to be a pure function or just like a function like this. I want it to be an arrow function just because that's what I like it to be. So like so, everything should still work. Yep, cool. But now I want to be able to store this amount of times I click. And does anybody recall what data that is stored locally to the component is called?
Is it state?
Yep, exactly. It's state. But there's a very, you can't like in React, you can't just be like const clicked equals 0. And I want to store that here. Like so, you can't just do that. there's a specific pattern that you have to in order to declare state in a component, because this might change at some point and there might be it would inject some weird behaviorals into your React. So we must declare state a specific way. So yeah. So using a functional based component, and we'll do this in using a class based component because it's a little different, but I'm going to import React. It's always just, I don't know, it's good practice, but you don't necessarily have to import React at the top all the time, but a lot of people, it's just by default, you always are like importing React at the top. And in order to declare state, we need to use a React hook. That's what it's called, a hook called use state. And this use state, and you just want to import it from React. This use state hook is, it's a little confusing, but this use state hook is used to declare state as well as update the state. So like I was down here before, I was saying like const count counter equals 0. You can't just have a method over here that says like that changes this or increases it by 1 each time. There's a specific way you must update state. So this use state hook, it's interesting because it returns 2 things. Usually a function or something only returns 1 thing. This use state hook returns 2 elements or 2 things. The initial state that you want, as well as a function to update the state. And I'll show you what that looks like. So const, I'm going to do some array destructuring here. So I'm going to say the variable that I want state to be called is counter. And the function that I want to be able to update this state is going to be called set counter. So this is best practice. If you look at the React docs, so hooks, if I look at hooks, using the use state hook right here. So declare a new state variable, which we'll call count, and set count. The set counter equals use state. And this function is, I'm going to pass in the initial value of counter, where the initial value is 0, like so. And now here, in order to do JavaScript, inject JavaScript into my JSX, or what looks like HTML, is just to do curly braces and followed by whatever variable you want. Questions on the use state hook? So again, this use state hook returns 2 elements or two things. The initial value of my state, which I'm calling counter. So I'm saying, hey, I want the state to be called counter. And then it returns another function, or returns another element, which is a function, and I'm calling that set counter. And now I'm here, I'm saying you've been clicked counter times. So this variable's counter, which is initial value is 0. So if I refresh that, or not even refresh it, I can see I have been clicked 0 times. All right. Questions? Now I need to create an on-click event handler that says when I click this, I want it to update this counter. So I can write a function called const handle click. Which, again, this is just a function within this app component that's, in order to update this counter, I need to call set counter. So I can say set counter. I can say counter plus 1. So the set counter, I'm taking the original value, which is 0, and I'm adding 1 to it. Counter plus 1. And so down here in my button, I can add up a property called onClick. And then in curly braces, I'm going to call this handle click method. So again, I created a function called handle click that calls the set counter function, which is responsible for updating the counter state. And then down here in my button, I added an onClick event. And every time I click it, it executes this handle click function. So if I come over here, I'm able to update state. Now it's better practice to do previous state. To do something like this as a closure. So it doesn't include, still works, but on the off chance there might be issues with, I don't want to say this is wrong and this is right, but just know that this will prevent on the off chance that things don't occur correctly or in a timely fashion within your app. So I'm just going to keep it from here right now. Like so, it still works. Great. Questions on updating state? Whoa, that's weird.
The that doc that you were just at, they do the onClick kind of inline. Is that, should we, is one like better practice than the other, or should we lean towards one more than the other?
I would say where does it say?
You right there at the top.
Right here?
Yeah, it puts like where the button is. It uses the.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So like I would say this is okay right now. But again, there are off chances where things might not work as intended. But this is okay for right now. Yeah. So doing this will be fine. Cool. All right. So, let's go ahead and convert this to a class-based component real quick. So there's a couple of things we can do. So I just kind of want to show you functional-based component. So in order to make this a class-based component, I'm just going to copy this down here. Comment that out. I need to import the component class. I'm going to say class app extends component. And now I don't need any of this, but the class-based component, I need the render method at the very end, which returns this over here. But now I don't have state, or I don't have this handle click either. So in a component, I can declare state by saying state equals counter that. So state is always will always equal an object. And I can have multiple states in here, like counter, name. I can have multiple things in here. But for example, right now, state only has one element called counter, and it equals 0. But I can't refer to counter because counter's right here. It's looking for a variable called counter. I can reference state. So how would I access the state counter value in here?
State.counter.
State.counter. Oh, it's saying state is not defined. Again, remember, this is a class-based component.
It'll be this.counter, right?
This.state dot counter. Same with handle click. I need to create a variable called handle click, or a method called handle click. So I can say handle click. Again, I'm not doing const handle click because this is a class. Handle click. So the way to update state in a class-based component, you can't just, again, do this dot state dot counter plus equals 1. You can't do that. You can't just mutate state directly. React has a built-in method called set state. And that takes in the value of the state. So counter equals this dot state dot counter plus 1. So this is the original value of state right here, and I'm adding 1 to it, and I'm resetting it. And then down here it says handle click. I'm getting an error. Again, this is a class, so I need to refer to this dot handle click. I'm just showing this to you all just so you get familiar with class-based components as well. So there, now it works still. All right, so I'm going to go back. So this is class-based components, class-based component. But I'm going to switch back to the functional-based component, just because that's what I want to use for this one. I just want to make sure everything's still working. So if I refresh, cool, everything's still working in my functional based component. So now I want to set, I don't want this. So this is my main app. I don't want my main app to be responsible for the clicking of the button. I'm going to create another app. What should I do? Yeah. So in my source directory, I'm going to create I guess I'll say, I'm going to create a directory called components. And this is just how I'm doing it, but I'm going to create a components directory. And inside of here, I'm going to create a buttons. I'll just call it a default button directory. And then inside of there, I'm going to create a button class. Button, I'm going to call it default button.js. All right. So in this default button.js, I just want it to be responsible for handling state as well as this part right here. So I'm going to create a functional based component called default button. I'm going to do RCS. This is a code snippet, so it just automatically creates it real quickly for me, like so. It's kind of nice. So I've got my default button, and I'm going to say H1, here is my button. And over here inside my app.js, I want to import my default button class. So I'm going to say import default button from, I'm looking right here. Okay, it says components, default button, default button, like so. And now I'm going to remove this part. Or actually, I'm going to leave that there for now. And now I'm going to call my default button down here, like so. So I've created this default button that just says an H1 tag that says, here's my button. I'm importing it into my app.js, and I'm rendering it down here, right here within inside of my app.js component. If I refresh here, it says, here's my button. But again, I want to remove all of this stuff and put that in here. So I'm going to put that in there. Again, I don't want to have this stuff in here. I want that all state to be rendered in my default button, like so. And I also need to import the use state hook. Cool. So now my app.js, my app component is literally only responsible for rendering this default button component right here. Let's come back here and see if this still works. Cool. So it's been clicked 0 times. Nice. So it's still working. And I can see if I open up the Chrome DevTools, I can see here's my app component, and then here's my default button component. If I can look over here, so if I look up here, it doesn't have any props, but if I look in my default button component, it doesn't have any props initially, but the state is 18 right there. You can kind of see it. And if I click it, notice how state is going up right there. Oh. There we go. See how state's kind of cool. And what's the benefit of doing it like this? What if I wanted to render a bunch of buttons like so? Now, if I come back here, notice how many buttons I have. There we go. But what will happen if I click the click me? Will it update all of the zeros or just one of the zero of the button I'm clicking?
Just the one you clicked.
Just the one I click? Anybody else want to?
I concur with Jeremy.
Okay. Yep. So if I click this, notice how this component's individual state is confined to its own component. Pretty cool, huh? Let's just have some fun. And, well, nah, I don't want to go that way. That might take some time. Cool.
Are you going to put it in Fibonacci or something?
No. I was going to make it so all of the state changes. Cool. So that's all great, but let's, instead of, maybe I wanted to render 1,000 buttons. Yeah, I wonder if my browser can handle that. So instead of doing this like until there's 1,000, I want to do it programmatically. So I'm going to create a function called render buttons. And this is just what I'm calling it. You can call it whatever you want. And this render buttons is responsible for rendering or displaying like 1,000 buttons. So I'm going to do const buttons or buttons. It's going to be initially an empty array. And I'm going to do a for loop for let I equal 0, I is less than or equal to 1,000, I plus plus. And I'm going to do buttons dot push. And what I'm going to push into here is a default button component. Why is that like that? Oh, right there. And at the very end, I'm going to return the buttons array. So this render buttons function, I've got an empty array. It loops through 1,000 times and it pushes a default button component into this array. And then it returns an array of default button components. And then down here, again, I'm going to do some JavaScript inside of my JSX. I'm going to call this render buttons function. So when this app comes in here, let's get rid of that. Comes in here, comes down to this, again, this is just a function, comes in here, comes down to this return statement, runs this div. I execute this render buttons function, comes up here, executes this, creates an array, an empty array, loops through it, adds 1,000 default button components to this buttons array, and then it returns a buttons array of 1,000 default button components. So if I refresh that, now look at it. This is 1,000 buttons. Each one of them has its own unique state. All right, let's just do 100, not 1,000. All right.
And because they're unique, they have their own state, but that also, when you click it, it's really quick to, it's not re-rendering the whole page, right?
Right. It's literally only rendering or updating this portion of the code. All this other code is staying the same. Now so before I go into that or continue that route, I'm just gonna render a buttons, like a single default buttons array, or I'm sorry, default button right here, like so. And maybe I want the initial value of this to be something, or hold on, I'm gonna actually say something else. I'm gonna say name you have clicked times or whatever. So I want to just have a name variable, but I want this name variable to be dynamic to this buttons class. So depending on whoever's in here, I want to pass some data down to the buttons component. When I'm passing data down from a parent component down to a child component, what is that called? What's the keyword, the reserved keyword?
Props.
Yep, props. So I want to pass props down to this default button. So I'm calling the default button here, and now I'm able to pass in props into this component. As simple, just like you're doing this on click right here, or you're adding attributes to a HTML element, you can do that like here as well. So I'm going to say first name equals Tom. So I'm passing first name as a property down to the default button component. But I need to pass in props to the functional based component, literally just by doing props. And now I can have access to all the properties that are being passed down to this component. So I can say props dot first name right here. So I'm passing first name down as a prop to the default button. So props dot first name, you have clicked this many times. So if I refresh that, it says Tom, you have been clicked you have clicked, something like that. So I can pass in anything down here now, like age, whatever I want. Now in here, I can have props like that, but if I had to pass in like a bunch of different properties, say there was like 10 different things I was passing into the default button, that can be kind of cumbersome to do, like props.first name, props.age, props.whatever other property I'm passing down. So I can actually do some destructuring here, const, and I can say first name equals props. So I'm literally destructuring, I'm grabbing first names from the props object And so now when I refer to the first name, I no longer have to do props dot whatever. So it still works. And I can even console log in here. So in a functional based component, I can, again, this is just like a function, normal function. I can console log props. And if I come over here in the console, I can see my props. First name, Tom. If I had like location equals Chicago. Okay, I've got location, Chicago. And now here I can destructure location as well. But I'm not using location anywhere, so it doesn't really matter. And now here I can also do like that, refresh it. Now this has changed. So questions about props?
So Tom, however many properties you have in there, you would just keep adding them to that list that you have there in the const equals props.
Yeah. Yeah, that's if you know specifically the properties. But yeah, this is pretty standard as far as how you just keep adding them to it. Yeah.
Right. So you don't like need a const for each property.
No.
You just put them in that same bracket.
Correct. Yep.
Cool.
Just like so.
Tom, I had a question about the render buttons method.
Yep.
So you're returning an array, and then when you rendered it within the return statement, it automatically took every element of that array and displayed it without you explicitly telling it to?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Cool. Now, let's make this default button a class-based component. So I'm going to import components at the top because it's a little different when it refers to props. So I'm going to comment that out. So I'm going to do class default button extends component state equals counter initial value 0. Handle click is no longer. I need to do this dot set state takes in an object counter equals this state dot counter plus 1. And instead of just returning, I need to actually do a render return statement, a render return function. Put all the return statement into the render. I can say this dot handle click instead of counter this dot state dot counter. And let's get rid of the first name so far. Just so it works. I'll talk about props. Whoop. So I'm going to get rid of that render. Cool. So here, everything's still working. But I want to, so here in class-based components, I might be like, say, hey, I want a console log here, like what props are, like something. It's going to throw an error saying, hey, like console log, parse it, like, well, what does this mean? It's because it's a class-based component. You can't just console log anywhere within a class. So if you want to console log stuff, you have to do it within the in the render method between the return and the render. So, okay, we're getting somewhere close. All right, props is not defined. Again, this is a class. So I need to refer to it this dot props. Uh-oh, what happens? Oh, what the hell just happened? Props is not defined. Okay, there we go. So it may take a while for your browser to update the changes, so just be wary of that. So here in classes, props, so here and here, that I'm passing in first name, location, first name and location. This dot props is automatically passed in to a class-based component like so. Whereas in a functional-based component, I had to explicitly call or insert props in the function. Classes, you don't have to do that. But just like I destructured first name location from here in the class or functional-based component, I can do it down here as well. Const first name location equals this dot props. And now I can say first name and I'm not using location, just so Tom Anker, like so. Questions about passing data down from state to props, or I'm sorry, passing props down, like so. I just kind of want to show you something else you can do. So I'm going to say const parent state set parent state equals use state. What should I do? Or initially set it to 0. State. Parent state. So if I come over here, here's the parent state. Here's the state to the individual buttons. What if I wanted to pass down a method that stores all the times the parent state has been clicked? So I can say like handle const handle parent state clicked equals, it's a really long method, set parent state equals parent state plus 1. All right. So if I wanted to keep track of how many times anybody's clicked on here, so if I want this to also update this, again, I can pass this handle parent state clicked down as a property. I'm going to just call this one. So once we start passing a lot of stuff down like so, you can start doing stuff like this just to keep things a little more organized. I'm going to say handle click, or I'm going to call this click, parent click. And I'm going to assign that to this handle parent state clicked. I'm going to pass that one down as well to this default button. So now when the this handle click, it updates the current state. I also wanted to run this dot props dot handle parent or parent click. See if this works. So that's not working there. Actually, I can just call it right here. So I'm executing two functions in this one. Parent. So I also want to parent click. There we go. Instead of this dot parent click, it's just this. Hold on a second. Why is it doing that? This stuff. Instead saw an expression. Sorry, hold on. I guess I could pass in parent click. Invoke. Let's see if this works. Oh no, what happened? Oh, this dot parent click. Yes, it is. Parent click. Handle parent state click. Parent click. I disregard what I'm trying to do. But I'm just wanting to let you know that you're able to pass things down. I'll do it down here. On click, just instead of making it difficult. All right. So parent state. Cool. So here, uh-oh. So I'm getting errors. Parent click. So I kind of deviated. So I just wanted to show you that. So you can click here and it updates the individual state. And I can also click here and it updates the parent state. So just an FYI that you can also pass down functions from the parent state down to a child state or a child component and execute those functions within the child component. So I declared this function up here in the parent component. I pass that function down into a child component and I'm executing that parent component's function right here. I just want to show you that that's possible. Does anybody have any questions?